for some context on our class, it looks like we've got a few folks who may be visiting. We are going through different prayers in the Bible with the direct objective of analyzing them to understand what we can learn about God from these prayers, what we can learn about maybe some of these templates or blueprints for what a proper relationship and prayer life looks like with Him, and then seek to understand like how we can very practically leverage the principles and the context and the insights around these prayers into getting better at praying and praying deeper things and praying different things in an attempt to improve our spiritual maturity. So this is the fourth lesson in this class. So far, all of the prayers that we've examined have come from the Old Testament, but now we've skipped rapidly moving into 2 Chronicles. So from a timeline piece, there's been a little bit of a change from the types of prayers that we've been looking at. Just as some maybe like immediate attention to the theme that we want to draw out from this evening. It's that God is a God who is there for us in times of trial. So He is near to people who are going through hard times, and He is able to lift them up and make them victorious, taking oftentimes people who are in weakness and making them strong for people who are humble and trust in Him. And that is the type of situation that we find ourselves examining this evening with the prayer of, crossing my fingers here, Jehoshaphat. That is a mouthful. It was a fingerful to type. Copy and paste came in handy a lot, but like if I mispronounce that, please show some grace, and you can say whatever you want in how you want to pronounce this guy's name. Not only is his name unique in the sense that we don't maybe meet too many people named Jehoshaphat, we meet some people named David. I know some soccer players named Solomon. We don't meet too many Jehoshaphat's, but he's unique beyond just his name because up to this point in the stories of the kings of Israel and Judah, he immediately jumps out as distinct because he actually prays to God. We've been going through this period in the kings of Israel and Judah where there's been a lot of wicked kings, and Jehoshaphat stands out as different. He's not perfect. He makes some mistakes. He gets into a marriage alliance with King Ahab, and that at best is foolish, but largely his reign and his life and service to God is characterized like through his service to God. He seems pretty faithful from a zoomed out perspective. So in this particular story, Jehoshaphat is surrounded by enemies. So there's a few different people groups, the Moabites, the Meunites, who later in the book are linked with like the Arab people, and then the Edomites. So there's these three different nations that have basically come together and surrounded Jerusalem. This assault, this military threat that Jehoshaphat finds himself in, interestingly enough, actually happens after he has done some significant religious reforms, like just in the prior chapter. Bible headings are like not authoritative. They're helpful as maybe like a frame of reference. If you look at chapter 20 in your Bible, you may have a heading that says Jehoshaphat's prayer. That's where we're going to spend a lot of time. But in 2 Chronicles 19, we read about Jehoshaphat's reforms. And so directly before this, he has done a lot of intentional work to try and turn the hearts of the people back to God. He's not perfect in that. It's not necessarily the most thorough reforms, but like he effectively has spent a lot of energy trying to serve God. So it's a little interesting that then like on the heels of that, you would then see like now the city gets surrounded and there's these three conquering nations like getting together to form a big gang to come kill everybody. You could kind of think like, well, God, how does that work? Like, is that punishment for maybe like a lack of accurate reform? There's a very similar instance with Hezekiah. later in Second Chronicles, where Hezekiah does a lot of reforms. He cleanses the temple and he turns a lot of people back to God, but then King Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, comes together to threaten Hezekiah. So there's maybe a parallel between these two kings who try and do a lot of reforms and turn the people back to God, but then this big imposing military threat comes in immediately after that. But in both instances, despite that being a very terrifying or scary instance, the end result is that God's presence and victory comes through to win the day, and we see a picture of a righteous king enjoying victory in warfare and rest after his enemies. So the end result of this story is victory, but in the moment, it's very uncertain. And so that tension, I think, is very important for us to understand maybe some of the questions that Jehoshaphat asks in this of, God, where are you? We are completely surrounded by this great horde of people. But in this, as we'll read, rather than accusing God of betraying him because of these circumstances, he actually turns and encourages the people to get together and serve God, to get together and fast all throughout the land, and that all the cities and everyone in Judah would come together in this moment and stand as one unified people and seek God. In that moment where there is ultimate tension, these three conquering nations are looking around us, about to come in and destroy the city. They overwhelm Jehoshaphat and the number of people who maybe would be there to defend. He points them to God and he prays this prayer, which is what we will now read. So 2 Chronicles chapter 20, starting in verse 5. And Jehoshaphat stood in the assembly of Judah and Jerusalem in the house of the Lord before the new court and said, O Lord God of our fathers, are you not God in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. In your hand are power and might, so that none is able to withstand you. Did you not, our God, drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham, your friend? And they have lived in it, and they have lived in it and have built for you in it a sanctuary for your name, saying, if disaster comes upon us, the sword, judgment, or pestilence, or famine, we will stand before this house and before you, for your name is in this house, and cry out to you in our affliction, and you will hear and save. And now behold, the men of Ammon and Moab and Mount Seir, whom you would not let Israel invade when they came from the land of Egypt, and whom they avoided and did not destroy, behold, they reward us by coming to drive us out of your possession, which you have given us to inherit. O our God, will you not execute judgment on them? For we are powerless against this great horde that is coming against us. And then he ends with this really poignant phrase, we do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. So a couple points quickly. We see that Jehoshaphat has a higher degree of trust in God than he does in military resources. And he appeals to God based on some of these earlier promises. If you were to try and break up this section or this prayer and understand the different elements of it. We've talked in some of the previous prayers about how there's this component of praise, and then there's this component of thanksgiving, and then supplication or an ask. Structurally, if you were to go in and put little division markers or say, this is one section of this prayer, this is another section of this prayer, where would you do that? Or how would you break up the first section?
There's an initial statement of praise, probably, I would call that middle verse 6. He then goes and kind of like asking questions and doing other things, but there's an initial statement.
Yeah. So verse 6 and maybe even 7 like combine into this element of praise that I think at almost every other prayer we've looked at, like a lot of them just begin with praise. So we see there's this central theme through a lot of these prayers we've looked at that are around, like the praise specifically here is geared around his sovereignty and his power. Does anything stick out to you about the power that he cites? Maybe like
God of heaven, but he's the God over all things here.
Yeah. So God's jurisdiction expands just beyond Israel and beyond Judah. He's referenced here as the God of our fathers, and the God in heaven, and he rules over all the kingdoms of the nations. Which that is a particularly relevant thing to say when you're like in this situation surrounded by 3 enemy nations and saying like, God, we are recognizing that you are actually the one who's in control of this situation and you reign over all of these people. And this praise is interesting because it's somewhat formed in a series of questions. And I don't know that we normally like praise God in that way. At least personally, like it's a lot more declarative, and it's like, God, you are all these things. We don't tend to praise interrogatively of like, God, are you not the God who made the universe? So some of that may be cultural, but I think also it's intentionally woven in this way because some of it is like kind of the primary complaint. This is similar to laments, where asking God pointed, bold, honest questions is somewhat a way of trying to reconcile, like, if these things are true, then why is this happening? So questions like, are you not God in heaven? Did you not, God, drive out the inhabitants of this land and give it to the descendants of Abraham? Like, weren't we supposed to be the ones who had this land in the first place? Then how come it looks like we're about to lose it? The next section, if you were to try and break it up, I think is probably in like...
Can I say something?
Oh, sure. Sure.
If somebody comes up to a craftsman, let's say they can be a great carpenter, somebody can really do something really neat. I kind of and they say, either I hear you're really good at this, or are you not the best around? And it makes them really want to do something for you because you kind of butter them up a little, And I think that the question may be posed because he, in some way, he thinks it may prompt the answer that he wants instead of just asking for what it is.
So I would maybe disagree with you there only because he doesn't actually make a direct ask in the prayer. He only asks these kind of rhetorical questions and then leaves it in God's court. So I understand what you mean in terms of like he's asking those questions and invoking some of these promises, but I don't know that I would say he was buttering him up. But that I don't want to get too nitpicky over words. I understand what you mean. The next section is maybe in verses 7 through 10, and he instigates like this historical review. It's rhetorical because he knows definitively that God did drive the inhabitants of the land out, and he knows that there's this prayer that you don't necessarily see hyperlinked or see referenced here, but it's on our worksheet here. It's referenced in maybe like the third point under special characteristics or themes or patterns to this prayer of Solomon at the dedication of the temple back in 2 Chronicles chapter 6. Basically, when Solomon was dedicating the temple, he leads this very beautiful, very public prayer that says, like, when the people of your covenant, when the Israelites, when the people of Judah, when they are in these times and these situations and they come to the temple and they look at the temple and they consider your covenant and they're in these exact circumstances and they pray these things, would you come rescue them and deliver them? And so he very clearly is referencing this, even though it may not immediately jump off the page as we're directly reading this. Later in 2 Chronicles, so that promise to Solomon happens in chapter 6. And in chapter 7, God explicitly confirms that he's heard Solomon's prayer and thinks that that's appropriate and says that he's going to come through for the people when they do this sort of thing. So in a very structurally appropriate way, and this will be one of our takeaways from this prayer is very intentional in how it's structured topically. You don't get into praise of God in these questions that also just happen to be kind of your main complaint on accident. And we don't get to reference these direct prayers of Solomon using the specific language of some of the things, like when verse 9 particularly, if disaster or sword or judgment or pestilence or famine, we will stand before this house and before you. You don't just rattle that off on accident without intentionally considering why that's directly in the prayer. We then get into just structurally, verse 10 pivots. So it's not the historical review of the things that God has done. It's not these praise questions that are somewhat of a complaint. It's somewhat of a transition verse. And now behold, kind of saying, and here is now the current situation that we're in, where we've got these people who you would not let Israel invade, and whom Israel didn't invade, and they didn't destroy. And then in verse 11 is the complaint. And this is how they're treating us. Behold, they reward us by coming to drive us out of your possession, which you've given us to inherit. So, if we looked back in Deuteronomy in Moses' day, God had not allowed the people of Israel to go to war with Moab and Ammon. They were not allowed to do that. And they have followed God's will in not doing this, the people of Israel. And now they're kind of sitting around and this is how you repay us? We came into the land and we left you alone, and now all of a sudden you're going to gang up on us and come in and try and wipe us out? That specifically goes against God's promise to give us this land? And then in verse 12 is the ask, right? So he makes no specific request beyond just some of these rhetorical questions. Will you not execute judgment on them? I think this is maybe what I was getting at with the point around with Wayne of Jehoshaphat does not try and convince God or manipulate him. Instead, he confesses their helplessness and he leaves the matter entirely in the hands of God for what to deal with it. So he says, we do not know what to do. This great horde that is coming against us, we're powerless against them. But our eyes are on you, we're going to look to you for deliverance in this situation.
Many times we hear in prayers, if it's your will, let this thing be done. And it seems as if he's saying this, he's showing God's will, and that he is in heaven. He does have authority. He has said this before. So he's invoking God's will that he already said. And I think we can do that in our own prayers a lot. Not just asking that it's his will, but actually telling God, conversating with God about how his will has been established before.
Okay, that's such a good point. And that is like a central theme that's been in maybe 3 of the 4 prayers we've looked at so far. This idea of praying God's promises to him and being on extremely sure footing when we're doing that. Like looping back to the very first one about interceding for the wicked and asking that God would show mercy. Us asking God to show mercy makes sense because he is merciful. We're like appealing to his character in that. Maybe our first like connection or takeaway point from this, from the themes to note of praying the promises, there's lots of prayers in the Bible that refer to the promises. I don't know that you will find one that like per words of prayer to then like references to God's promises is as tightly ratioed. Like he references David, Solomon, Abraham, your friend, the time of Moses, and Joshua in like a period of 6 verses. In doing that specifically, and this is like a really interesting point that Mara's hitting at, when he references like that you promised this to the descendants of Abraham, your friend, and referencing Moses, referencing in verse 10, referencing David, he hits on these different covenants. It starts off in verse 6, and it's, O Lord, the God of our fathers, the God who's in heaven. But then verse 7 says, our God. So what does that tell you about his understanding of who God was to those people and who God is to him? Or maybe in another way, are those different gods, or does he view that as the same? He views it as the exact same, and the promises are the exact same. For Jehoshaphat, and similarly to what Mara's talking about for us, like the facts that we know about God in the past and our current realities like blend together because who God was is who God is and who God will be. And so when we appeal to his promises, we can be very confident in like that that's his will, but also that he's going to be consistent. I think another thing that is interesting, or like a takeaway for this, is that this prayer, and Michael made a comment about this a couple weeks ago, of like the intentionality and structure of prayer. It is very unlikely that this prayer was just like an off-the-cuff, hey, Jerry, you've got the closing prayer in like 3 minutes. Can you get up there and do this for us? Like, he has asked all the people to go into a fast and to come together collectively like for this moment. And this is an extremely intimidating and scary situation. So he's probably been praying some form of prayers like this for a few days, but now we've gathered like all of the people around, and the armies are just outside the city wall, and there's this like moment of, and this is the collective prayer that we're going to pray. So the thoughtfulness to reference all of these things, to have this together and put in this way, to lead publicly with like references to God's promises and his history, I think gives us a lot to consider for public prayers that we lead in times of crisis and hard moments, but like certainly not exclusively to that. That's maybe one of like a reflection question is, what are some of the steps we could take, or what are some instances where praying a prayer that is very carefully scripted or very thoughtfully built out, when and where would that be appropriate today, considering we don't have like armies surrounding the Woodland Hills Church building at the moment physically?
Personally, Evan's aunt has brain cancer, and so a lot of the women got together and wrote prayers and said those aloud and gave them to her. So definitely a time that a well thought out prayer would be appropriate.
Definitely.
Funerals.
Tell me more about that.
You've got a mixed audience a lot of times of folks that come from all sorts of different backgrounds. And it's a good opportunity to share your faith in a way as you pray.
I think considering the audience of things like that at a funeral, but is perfectly appropriate. Considering the circumstances is perfectly appropriate of someone in a hard time. Like those moments that maybe it requires a little bit of extra tact, a little bit of extra care, become perfectly appropriate to leverage something like this, or maybe the principle like this as a template.
When financial uncertainty, especially when it was very high, and with inflation and everything else that's around the corner, we just have to remember there's a charge. And sometimes I think he remembers a time he messed up because he depended on that relationship with Ahab, and all the prophets had said, yeah, go up and fight. And he messed up because he didn't listen to the guy and said, it's not going to work. And now he is saying, well, I think I'm just going to depend on you. It's really it may be as a result of the failure they had before. And if we look at our past failures, when we thought we could fix something, and it didn't work, and we say, well, it's just best to depend on God.
What you're getting at is maybe something we'll hit on at the end of what are situations that we would find ourselves in where we say we are powerless before this and we don't know what to do and our eyes are on you. Like that element, whether it's financial troubles or anything else, I think is very relatable. Yeah. There's a couple other things I think we can identify from this and then have some questions and then do our exercise. I think the nature of God, the description of God at the opening of the prayer is very interesting. What are some ways that he relates to God, or what are some of the ways he describes God in the beginning of the prayer?
God of our fathers.
God of our fathers. So God is kind of like this ancestral God. There's several. So rapid fire. Yeah.
Kind of like bookends it. It says, everybody's powerless before you. At the beginning there when he says, so that none is able to withstand you. And then at the end, we're powerless before them. So that everyone's powerless before you, we're powerless before them. Do something.
Sure, yeah. So you're all-powerful. You're universal in the sense that you are able to be God in heaven, but also not so far away that your reach isn't relevant in our personal lives and relevant to these surrounding nations. There's, I think, just some important things that we can learn in putting our trust in God, that he is trustworthy because he has shown himself to be trustworthy in the past, and all of his promises are true. His power and presence are not limited in any way whatsoever, and his nature as the creator of the universe means there's no nation or foe who's outside of his control. When we properly position God, and that's what a lot of these praise elements will do, but when we really consider the nature of God, that then, to get what Michael's talking about, helps us frame up how we are unable to stand before him. It positions us properly in the relationship, but it also helps us to trust in him more when we consider the attributes of his character and his track record of how he's come through for his people in the past. Specifically, in a riff off of that is God's power in really hard times. I feel like I interrupted my father-in-law, so you go ahead.
But connecting to the thing that the mention of God of our fathers, or God of our ancestors, God is timeless. Here they are trapped in a time frame of their life, and they need God to break a time for them and intercede. And this has happened in Jehoshaphat's life in chapter 18. He was on the battlefield. He cried out to God, help me. And God did. He directed the assault from him to the king of Israel. The king of Israel gets shot. and he survives. Jehoshaphat knows this guy, and he knows how timeless this guy is. And in this moment, as you brought up about the scripting of this, he's pulling together the covenant relationship that the whole nation should feel with this God, because the covenant Jehoshaphat feels with him is personal. God saved me on the field, and God is going to save us on this field.
That's a great point. Yeah.
You're talking about the nature of God, and I really like verse 7, and he mentions that Abraham was his friend. And I think it's good and right to fear God, because he is powerful and mighty and no one can withstand him. But as he says here, we need to understand that he is capable, and we are capable of being a friend of his, and God is capable of being a friend to us. So there's a balance there.
There is a balance. There was a quote that I felt like I would butcher if I paraphrased it, but the one to whom you can turn when there is no one else to go is the one to whom you should first turn to on every occasion. In other words, when it feels like you have no other option and God's the only place that you have left, he's the only foothold you have left when nothing else is going to land, that's actually the place we should go first, rather than just wait until we're in this situation where we have nothing left and God is constant and he's present and he's there in distress. But how much better it would be if we could be like Abraham, to Jacob's point, and like be his friend and turn to him first in those situations. There's a few other like maybe larger themes of like strength in weakness, how Jehoshaphat can't really fully trust in God if he's trusting in his own military might. And sometimes like circumstances help us out with that a little bit, where it makes it really clear that we can't endure things on our own and we're going to need God's help for that. But oftentimes, just as like a note of personal reflection, isn't it really easy to try and do everything we can first to fix it before we actually go to God? A couple last points before some questions. Later, and we didn't read this in the prayer, but Jehoshaphat ends up getting up early the next morning, which is a phrase we see when people typically are kind of head on facing difficult things to do in the Bible, with Abraham or Jesus or Abimelech. And he leads the people to the battlefield. He's not overwhelmed with continuing fear, but he has prayed, he's put it in God's hands, and now he's trusting in God to deliver him. That's not to say that all of our concerns are miraculously and immediately removed, or that our trust needs to shift from we've given it to God, but now we're just really going to trust in what we go do. But the Bible is really clear that we can be confident in God's response and that he's going to care for his people. And that if we trust in him, that's when then we can act with confidence. Do you see the parallel between Jacob's prayer that we looked at a couple weeks ago, when he found out that Esau was coming to ride at him with 400 men, and it's this really scary situation, and Jacob kind of says this bullet arrow prayer, and he's like, God, please be with me. You took me here, and hopefully you're not going to let me die. I don't understand how this is going to work. But then he still has to immediately make a decision and make an action. It feels like this, where in this moment, Jehoshaphat is surrounded, and whether he likes it or not, those armies are going to try and come to battle. And so he can trust in God, but he's still ultimately got to make a decision. So the question for us to consider is how do we properly balance the tension between, I know I need to leave this in God's hands and I need to trust in him, but on a very practical, functional level, I still have to make logistical choices.
adding one more variant to that. Like in the days of Ahaz, when Assyria was threatening Israel, or not Syria, that is Syria was threatening Israel, and or threatening Judah and Israel and Syria had banded together. And God says, "You don't worry about them. I'm going to take care of them. They're not going to be a problem for you." And Ahaz turns around and continues to trust in other nations, seeks them. There's a point in which, yes, you do what is necessary, that is your part of this. Success is with the Lord. But on the other hand, a lot of times, the part that I'm maybe doing is sinful. It's not really trusting Him. It's trusting my own strength and power to get something done. I don't know. I think today is something simple, like, okay, I'm really trusting God that when I get to the point that I can't work, I'll have some kind of retirement that I can live on. Okay, I'm trusting you, God. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to quit everything I'm doing, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to go. That's true. So I'm going to go cruising.
Well, it's a fine line between being prudent and saying, like, I still want to plan and have an ability to make the right choice. My trust in God doesn't allow me to then just squander everything I have in that example, right? And be like, well, God's going to take care of me in retirement, so I can just blow through it and go on a cruise every day. But by that same token, there is an element of trust where you say, like, I don't fully understand how this is going to work, but I know that it's going to work.
Or I decide that I'm going to go get a job in which I don't serve the Lord anymore.
Right.
I just have to work. I mean, there'd be a jillion things people do.
Yeah.
Similar to other aspects of life, we've got to evaluate our choices based on the Word, and we need to communicate with our brothers and sisters and check ourselves. To be around each other, to be able to go, hey, does this seem like a good idea? Does this make sense? Talk to people who are more experienced. Same as all the other things.
Sure.
I feel like sometimes, though, we're so quick to make that qualification of, like, I'm going to trust God, but I have to have my ducks in a row in case and all that, and make sure I'm working still whenever He does come through. I feel like there's room sometimes for, I don't know, like, we want to make sure we're not feeling lazy or anything like that, but there's room sometimes for, like, a full surrender and waiting on God to actually come through and do something for you.
This is kind of an extreme example. I have a friend who quit his job because he felt like it was not what he was needing to be doing with his life right in that moment, and then said, I'm going to wait and pray until God shows me the direction that I'm supposed to have next. And he was unemployed for like a couple of months. And after a certain point, we were like, hey man, like, he might not show it to you immediately, and like, you should get a job. But the heart of that was very trusting. And I think it's quick to maybe react to that and be like, this guy. But I learned a ton from that, of like, he's very willing to stop and consider and put that in God's hands. And so that's a brutal question to ask, of how do we properly navigate that tension, because like, I don't think any of us really have a perfect answer to that, and a lot of circumstances are very different. But if the general theme and principle is, how can I make it to where I'm trusting in God as much as humanly possible? And maybe like one of the ways to do that is by taking the time to thoughtfully craft intentional prayers that reference His character and His promises and His track record, and then knowing that the decisions that I make in my life are going to be influenced like through that lens. Yeah.
Just some thoughts real quick. So you were talking about a second ago how sometimes the last thing we resort to should be the first. And when I look at this story and we see Jehoshaphat and the situation that the nation of Israel and Judah are in, and just how they're surrounded, we see him go directly to God, whereas historically, whether you look at movies and that kind of thing, you're always seeing these kings are taking, okay, we need to rally. Someone says, hey, king, we're surrounded. Okay, rally the troops, get everyone prepared. And we see in the very beginning of the chapter, he set his face to seek the Lord and proclaim the fast. So his first thought was go directly to God. And it's like, okay, well, after he prayed to God, he went and got his troops ready. And then you read in verse 13, and who was around him? It was little ones, wives, and their children. So not even soldiers or anything. And so as we continue reading, we get this picture that, as we've all been discussing here, that Jehoshaphat wasn't at all relying on any of his power or strength as king, but fully relying on God, to the point where, after verse 18, bowed his head, faced the ground, and all Judah and everyone, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, fell down before the Lord, worshiping the Lord. They were putting it all in God's hands, and we see the benefit here. And it brings me to verse 12, where it says, we do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. And it just puts into that frame that in this moment there was no other option. They knew they were outnumbered, they knew they were outclassed, that they couldn't fight against these people. They knew they had to rely on God. And by saying we do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you, it's basically saying we're looking to you, God, for salvation. We're looking to you to save us from this situation where we don't know if you're going to do it, we don't know how you're going to do it, but we believe that you can do it, which is very similar to Daniel and all that stuff there. But
yeah, there's some other examples of that for sure. The total reliance on God. Maybe we can take the last couple of minutes and briefly do our prayer exercise, which I think is ultimately going to be very helpful if we can continue to do this as like maybe homework in between classes. Like take what we've learned and consider, and then go try and figure out, if I was to write a prayer like this, what would it sound like? Or what are some times and moments in my life where we could do that? If we were to try and leverage this as a template, the primary elements are a confession of helplessness and leaving things entirely in God's hands. And there are some questions that work as both praise and kind of a complaint, or praise and like a question around understanding of how things would happen in this situation. Given that we've only got a couple minutes left, what would be an example of like language we could use to confess our helplessness before God and rely on Him in a situation where we don't really know what to do?
I just wrote that God, you are always with me and have always had control of everything in my life leading up to this point. So I've been powerless. I've been powerless, and you have carried me up to this point and shown that you've taken care of me.
So God, you're always with me, and you've always been in control of my life up to this point, and you still are now. Anybody have maybe anything they would add to that, or try and loop that into an ask, or to an additional component of that?
It seems to me that the centers that are on the character of God, the historical, provable character of God, and it's such trust that way. You just saying, are you not this? Yes. You're this? Yes. Okay. That's what I'm putting my trust in.
Yeah.
If
But-
you could take control now, as you have always taken control without needing.
Yeah. Let's say that prayer just really quickly, and then we'll be done. God, when we consider your track record and all of the ways that your promises have come true and your ultimate control in our life, we ask that you would take control of situations that we may be going through in our lives where we feel helpless and powerless. That you would be just as near to us as you always are, but that we would lean on you even more. We know that you have been in control our entire lives, And sometimes there are moments in our life where we just do not know what to do. But collectively and individually, we just pray that our eyes would be on you, and we would look to you for salvation. We would look to you in every circumstance. Amen.